All right, let's jump right in. Today we're doing a deep dive into Syria under the Assads. You guys sent in some pretty fascinating stuff for this one. Historical accounts, some economic analysis, even some, I guess you could say, political whispers.
It's going to be interesting, that's for sure.
Yeah, it seems like we've got a real puzzle on our hands here. So to really get this deep dive started, maybe we should start with, well, the Assads themselves, right?
Well, to understand the Assads, you kind of have to understand Syria before the Assads.
Oh, okay. So like the foundation, kind of.
Exactly. You see, Syria wasn't always this unified political entity. I mean, even under the Ottomans, it was more like this patchwork of different forces.
Okay, forces like...
Well, you had religious sects, like the Alawites, the Druze.
Ah, the Druze. I remember reading about them, how they kind of had their own thing going on, even way back then.
Yeah, they carved out a pretty impressive level of independence, even under the Ottomans.
So like a preview of the power struggles to come, kind of?
Exactly. And then on top of that, you've got the French Mandate period.
Uh-oh. Doesn't sound like things are getting any simpler.
No, not really. That period, honestly, it just added more fuel to the fire.
In what way?
Well, the French, they basically played this divide and rule game.
With the different groups in Syria?
Yeah, they pitted minorities against each other.
Wow, so they just like amplified all those existing tensions.
Exactly, and you could argue that they laid the groundwork for a lot of the sectarian strife that, that we see in Syria even today. So imagine inheriting this whole mess as a new leader.
Yeah.
Talk about a challenge, right?
Yeah, no kidding. So that brings us to Hafez al-Assad, right?
Mm-hmm.
Coming into power in 1970 with this totally fragmented country.
Mm-hmm.
And a history that's just, it's overflowing with tension.
It's a lot to deal with.
Yeah. So did he try to unify things, or did he kind of lean into the divisions?
Well, Hafez was really strategic. He understood that to consolidate power in this kind of environment, you needed a delicate touch.
So how did he play it?
His economic policies are a good example, actually.
Okay, what did he do?
He actually encouraged some private commerce. It created a semblance of, economic liberalization. But at the same time, he was expanding state control over key industries.
So it was this balancing act, not just about growing the economy, but also controlling it.
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing how he used economic levers to, weave this web of loyalty and dependence, especially in Damascus.
How so?
Favoring certain businesses, steering investments strategically. It was all designed to tighten his grip on power.
Right. It makes a lot of sense. But if we're talking about control, we kind of have to talk about the darker side of Hafez's regime, right? Like, he wasn't exactly known for being a champion of free speech.
Definitely not. There are some pretty chilling accounts of how he silenced any opposition.
Did any of your research dive into those methods?
Yeah, one historian detailed how Hafez went after any perceived threats, especially among the Sunni Muslim majority. They often felt excluded from power.
So what did that look like?
Well, it wasn't pretty. We're talking imprisonment, torture, even disappearances.
It sounds like a climate of fear.
It was, and it effectively stopped any kind of organized opposition.
So Hafez, he brought stability, but it definitely came at a price. Did any of your sources talk about how regular Syrians lived under this system?
There's this one sociologist who painted a picture of daily life that's it's surprisingly nuanced. On one hand, there was definitely fear.
Makes sense.
But there was also this sense of order, predictability even. Like, you could generally get basic necessities. The economy, though tightly controlled, did grow some. So you had this complex social reality where many Syrians, they may not have loved the regime's tactics, but they still found ways to coexist with the system.
Yeah, okay, I see. So it's like this pressure cooker waiting to explode.
Exactly. And as we know, that explosion did eventually come. But that's a story for next time.
Okay, we'll pick that up in part 2.
Welcome back. So last time we were talking about Hafez al-Assad, right?
Mm.
And that system of control he built. And, all those simmering tensions right under the surface.
Yeah, it definitely felt like a storm was brewing. So then, in 2000, enter Bashar al-Assad. Did any of the sources talk about what people were expecting from him? Was there, a hope for change?
Oh, yeah. There was a lot of optimism. For a while, people were calling it the Damascus Spring.
I've heard of that.
Especially younger Syrians. They were hoping that Bashar, with his Western education, all his talk about modernization, they thought he'd bring a new era, more openness, reform, that kind of thing.
And he did try some economic reforms, didn't he? Like trying to liberalize certain sectors.
He did, yeah. One economist you shared pointed out that these early reforms, they were limited, but I mean, at least they showed he was willing to, like, experiment a little, try loosening the state's control on the economy.
It sounds like it wasn't all smooth sailing.
No, not at all. That same source suggested that Bashar was facing a lot of pushback. From the old guard, the ones who were, like, really entrenched in his father's system.
Makes sense, I guess, like those ghosts of the old regime. Did any of the sources give any examples of that pushback?
Well, there's this one anecdote about a privatization plan. It ended up getting totally shelved.
Why? What happened?
Because of pressure from those powerful figures within the regime. They saw it as a threat, a threat to their interests, their control.
So even as Bashar's trying to modernize, he's stuck dealing with this whole, like, web of power and patronage from his father. It's like walking a tightrope. How did he handle that, especially when it came to, like, the international scene?
It's tricky for sure. On the one hand, he's trying to present this modern image. He's trying to get closer to Turkey, even hinted at possible peace talks with Israel. But then at the same time, he's still using many of his father's, repressive tactics.
So it's that duality that makes him such a, I don't know, a confusing figure. Did any of the sources get into how the Syrian people felt about all of this? Were they buying into the reforms?
One political scientist argued that a big part of Bashar's early popularity came from this, like, genuine desire for stability. People were tired of the isolation, tired of the West looking at them with suspicion. They wanted progress.
But obviously that hope didn't last.
Right. Something had to give.
And then in 2011, it did, with the Arab Spring.
Yeah, all those uprisings across the region, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, it created this ripple effect that even reached Damascus.
And suddenly, Syrians felt empowered to speak up.
Exactly. They saw what was happening elsewhere, and they started demanding change themselves.
And Bashar's response, well, it wasn't exactly peaceful.
No, it was brutal. A total crackdown. The level of violence from the security forces, it shocked a lot of people. It was like a clear message. Bashar wasn't giving up control, no matter what.
And that's where things take a really dark turn. From reform to, well, all-out civil war.
That's right. And it's in this chaos that you really see the consequences of the Assad's grip on power. Syria's falling apart, armed groups are forming, and, well, the human cost is just devastating.
Yeah, it's easy to forget about the human side of things when we're talking about politics and policies, but ultimately it's the people who suffer the most. Did any of your sources offer any insights into what they were going through? Like, what was daily life like for them?
One journalist, embedded with an aid group, they wrote about life in Aleppo during the siege.
Oh, wow, Aleppo. That was rough.
Yeah, it was. Imagine a city that's constantly being bombed. Just leaving your house to find food or water. I mean, that could be a death sentence.
So we left off with Aleppo and just the horrible reality of daily life during the siege.
Yeah, it was a really grim picture.
It's important to remember, though, that, I mean, we're talking about real people here, mothers and fathers and children. Did any of the sources you read offer a more personal perspective on what they were going through?
Well, the journalist who's in Aleppo, he talked about how people were coping.
Wow. I mean, how do you even begin to deal with that kind of situation?
He was struck by, I guess you could call it the resilience of the human spirit.
Like, even in the face of all that suffering?
Yeah. Like, even when things were at their worst, people still found ways to help each other out. Neighbors sharing whatever food they had, doctors working in, like, these makeshift hospitals.
Wow. And I think it was during this period, too, that we started to see just a huge number of people fleeing Syria.
Millions.
Millions, yeah. Seeking refuge wherever they could find it. Did your research look into what happened to them?
Yeah, one report from the UN Refugee Agency, it highlighted the challenges they faced. Overcrowded camps, lack of health care, limited access to education.
So on top of everything else, they're having to rebuild their lives in a completely new place.
Yeah, it's a lot to deal with. And it wasn't just about the physical displacement either.
Right. There's the psychological trauma, too.
Right. One psychologist who was working with Syrian refugee children, she talked about how much the trauma was affecting them. Nightmares, flashbacks, trouble focusing.
Really sad. It makes you wonder, what does the future hold for Syria? I mean, is there any hope for things to get better?
It's hard to say for sure, but a few analysts did point to some grassroots initiatives, focused on reconciliation, on rebuilding.
Like coming from the people themselves?
Yeah. Local communities are tired of the violence. They want to find ways to heal those divisions that have torn the country apart.
It's really encouraging. But what about the international community? I mean, what role can they play in all of this?
One policy paper argued that for any kind of lasting solution, global powers have to step up.
How so?
Well, they need to prioritize humanitarian aid, they need to support peace-building efforts, and, they need to hold those who committed war crimes accountable.
If those things don't happen, it's hard to imagine things really changing.
Right. It's going to be a long road.
It is. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to remember that even in the midst of all this suffering, the human spirit is still there. It's still strong.
Yeah, there's still hope.
And maybe, just maybe, if we all do our part, we can help create a better future for Syria and its people. So that's it for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening.